Hi, and thanks for logging on to the Daily DVAR Halacha. And here's a brand new halacha for you, and it's for Wednesday, the 4th day of November. Here we go. Continuing on in our laws of yesterday, let's say you had a grinder or a blender or a food processor, and you, let's say, ground up in there some hot meat. The meat, I don't mean it was hot as in spicy, but it was hot as in temperature. Yad Soletispo it's called, something that would make your hand jump away from it, which, we could call that anything above, some people call it as low as 110 degrees, some people call it 160, so let's just say it's 160. Okay, it was good and hot. Your hand would jump away from that meat. And 160 Fahrenheit is what I meant. So it's hot meat, your hand would jump away from it, and it was ground up in a food processor. You have to pretty much treat that food processor as fleshik then after. So, because food processor, like the laws we've been discussing here, is a little bit like the press of a knife. You know, food processors are a blade that spins in there very quickly. And it's doing the same thing that a knife does, so it presses strongly against that meat, and therefore that food processor then has to be deemed fleishiks, meat food processor. So if you were to grind up some onions or some chrein in that food processor, and they have a sharp taste and everything, then they would have to be treated, those onions or that horseradish would have to be treated as fleshik also. Side note here, and that is that fried onions are not called a sharp item because by the time you fry them, they don't have that sharp taste anymore. So just note that fried onions are not considered a sharp item. Now let's say that same food processor that we've been discussing, let's say you ground up some potatoes or eggs in there. They are not a sharp tasting food, of course, and so the status with them would be that they don't pick up the they don't pick up the meat flavor from that blade that had spun, earlier against that meat, and that's because they are not a sharp item and they don't draw out the taste from the knife of the food processor all that strongly. So theoretically, if you ground up, but listen carefully, don't tune out on me, theoretically, if you ground up potatoes or eggs, which are a bland tasting food, in that food processor which had processed some meat, theoretically, if you had cleaned off that food processor really well, then that batch of potatoes or eggs would not be considered fleshiks because you had cleaned it off well. It's a bland tasting food, so it's not that strongly picking up the flavor from the knife of the food processor, and those potatoes or eggs would stay kind of parved if the food processor was really well cleaned. However, the sad thing to say at the end of this law is that it's halachically we consider it difficult to really clean a food processor really well. So it's best to have a food processor that just uses your meat for your meat meals, one that does your dairy for your dairy meals, and that's the better way to go because it's hard to say that I've really perfectly cleaned my food processor. Thanks for logging on. Log on again tomorrow for more. Bye-bye.